In this video, we're going to consider how mutagens operate. So we probably ought to think about what is a mutagen. So a mutagen is an agent that causes mutation. In other words, it triggers a mutagenesis. And that means it causes a permanent change in DNA. And usually we don't notice a mutation unless it actually has an effect. And usually we consider mutagens to have an adverse effect because they trigger disease, most commonly cancer. But they are also a source of variation, which is something that natural selection can act on and allow us to have evolution. So it's not always a bad thing. Let's consider some pictures here and see how they link to mutagens. So there's a whole variety of pictures here. Pause the video, have a good look at them and see how you think they might link to our topic of mutagens. So we've got a lot of different pictures here. We've got a couple of people to look at first. You might recognize this person from our DNA topic. This is Rosalind Franklin, and this lady here is Marie Curie. They are interesting because they both died from cancer, or at least a disease caused probably by radiation exposure. So Rosalind Franklin did a lot of work with X-rays to discover the structures of the proteins and DNA that she was working with, and Marie Curie worked to uncover lots of different radiation species and actually had a couple of them named after her. Rosalind Franklin died early at 37 from ovarian cancer, and Marie Curie died at 66 from aplastic anemia, which is a disease that's triggered in the bone marrow from repeated exposure to radiation, which would have damaged the DNA of those dividing cells in the bone marrow. Here is radiation being leaked out into the world. This is an image of a mushroom cloud after an atomic bomb explosion. And radiation can directly damage DNA. Here we have a biological mutagen, a virus. So there's a couple of common ones, HPV, which is human papillomavirus. That if you catch that, you're quite likely to get cervical cancer. And there's an image here, which is another virus-induced cancer. This is a Tasmanian devil. It's got a facial tumour, and that's caused by a virus that inserts itself into the genome of the Tasmanian devil, and it disrupts normal genes and turns them into cancer-causing genes. So that's creating what's called an oncogene, or a cancer-causing gene. There's a few other interesting pictures here. We all know that smoking is bad for you. There are lots of reactive species that are generated during smoking. And there are chemicals in tobacco like benzene that are also carcinogenic or cancer-causing. And those reactive species will attack DNA. We've got some moldy sweet corn here. There is a mold called... There's a mold which releases a toxin called aflatoxin, and that triggers mutations if you're exposed to it. And it's a big problem in Africa, where in some African countries where they rely on this, and the storage is an issue, and it's very humid, and you get lots of mold growing. What else we got here? We've got some more food products here, some cured meats. They themselves are not cancer-causing, but there can be some byproducts of metabolism released in your body or in your liver when you're processing all the sort of smoking agents and the curing agents, and they can cause cancer if exposed to them for long periods of time. And we are aware in Australia of the effects of UV light. So this is somebody using a solarium. They're banned now in Australia, artificial tanning, because we really understand just how damaging the UV radiation is to our DNA. And there are lots of chemicals like mercury and cadmium, and they interfere with the DNA repair process, as well as directly binding to DNA molecules. So all of these are connected with our topic of mutagens. So let's see exactly how mutagens operate with a few examples. And you don't need to remember absolutely everything, but you need to have a solid few examples of a few different ways that mutagens operate. So if we're looking at UV light, and this is a good one to consider because it links in with quite a few different areas of our syllabus. UV light triggers the formation of thymine dimers. So thymine dimers. Thymine is the T base in DNA, and dimer means two things joined together, and you'll notice that happening down here in the image. So we've got double-stranded DNA here. There happen to be two T's next to each other, but instead of hydrogen bonding across with the other strand of DNA, they have bonded to each other under the influence of UV light. And you can imagine that that little kink in the DNA that's been formed is going to be very difficult for any polymerase that's coming along to read it correctly, and definitely for DNA polymerase to try and copy that piece of DNA faithfully. And if it can't copy it correctly and it tries to guess what to put in there, it might put in the wrong thing, and then it's going to cause a mutation. So that's how UV light triggers possible skin cancers in the DNA of the cells in our skin. Other types of radiation can directly hit DNA atoms and knock off electrons, and this is going to change the composition of the DNA with a direct hit. So that's another way that ionizing radiation can cause a mutation. There are also chemicals that have unpaired electrons. They have very reactive properties, and these can be formed in a whole number of different ways, both directly and indirectly. So you can see here that UV light can interact with chemicals in the air, for example, oxygen in the air, and create a free radical, a very reactive species that will go and damage the DNA. So that's what's happening over here, the UV light from the sun. Air pollution can release chemicals that, in combination with the UV light that's already coming in through our atmosphere, it can cause a reactive species that directly hits the DNA. Ionizing radiation can be direct or indirect. It could be the kind of radiation you get like from a nuclear power plant or from the sun. Smoking, here we've got our reactive chemicals from smoking, so nitrous oxides and oxygen radicals attacking DNA. Even our own metabolism, as we discussed with those meats, as we break things down, can release species chemicals that will attack DNA. And even having lots of inflammation in our body can be very damaging. And that's why we are encouraged to eat things like antioxidants, because they soak up these free radicals. So things like vitamin C, vitamin E, they're really good for our bodies because they soak up these really reactive chemicals that would otherwise go ahead and damage our DNA directly here. Another way that chemicals can get involved is if they actually get into the DNA. They don't change the DNA molecule, the actual chemical structure of it, but they stretch the DNA molecule. So you can see here that something has got into the ladder steps, the base pairs. So it hasn't disrupted the base pairs themselves, hasn't changed them chemically, but they've got in the way. So physically, the DNA molecule has been stretched. And this is actually going to cause, you can see this little intercalating agent. Now this might be something like a dye, or it might be something like a stain used in biological laboratories. It could be something like ethidium bromide, which is used to visualize DNA. So we don't come across these kind of dangerous chemicals very often. Sometimes you meet them if you're undergoing chemotherapy for cancer, which is kind of ironic that we're treating ourselves with something that might also cause cancer, but you're trying to kill cells when you're treating cancer. If you stretch the DNA like this, you're going to cause a frame shift mutation. So that's where the codons are read incorrectly. And frame shift mutations cause big changes in the protein sequences that we get. So that's another one. Our next example, and our last example, is viruses that integrate into the genome. And I said there were two that are really well known for causing mutations. We've got HBV, which is human papillomavirus, causes cervical cancer and the facial tumours. And they actually put themselves directly into the DNA. So HBV, and they're called transposons. They jump into the DNA and they trigger changes. They affect the cell cycle. So when you are thinking about mutagens, think about categorizing them into one of three categories: electromagnetic radiation, chemicals that cause mutations, and naturally occurring mutagens. You could probably argue some of these will fit into more than one category, but you need to make sure you've got a good example for each category and an understanding of how they disrupt the DNA.